Good morning. Hamshech and Beis at the conclusion. We're learning the source material in Torah Ohr. The case we can finish at the bottom of the column, the fourth column, which is Dalet Dalet 39d, the bottom of page 78, the second column. So let's review what we've been learning, and then we'll continue. Okay. So, specifically, in the last two columns, last page, we've been learning about two types of Ner. That's what he calls it, Shnei Bchinas Ner. One is the candle of the soul, Ner Neshama, and one is the candle of a mitzvah, which leads them into Torah Ohr, the light of Torah. So first he explained the candle of the soul. Basically it means, in simple English, that each of us is empowered from birth with a soul, a living soul within us, a divine soul, which is like the wick. You compare that to the wick, because the soul does manifest within the body. It's not in another body, and it's not Ohr Ein Sof. It's not infinite light. It's a light like a wick that is inserted within the body and the animal soul to function in this world, like a wick that's inserted within oil. And the oil represents the animal soul in general, especially the intelligence, human intelligence, which is the driving force of the animal soul, just like the divine intelligence is the driving force of the divine soul. Okay. The mission of this soul is to transform the body and the animal soul to become fuel, shemen, not just that there's oil and intelligence, but intelligence that's harnessed and directed toward fueling and creating an Ohr Eliki. And that's the third component, the fire that the candle produces. And what is that fire? V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. Love of God with both sides of the heart, the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, the right side and the left side. And so the oil has been turned into fuel that fuels, that is, like he says, nimsheches acher hapsila. It follows the wick, meaning the divine soul's contemplation, the divine soul's direction and guidance. And specifically, he spoke about Shema, Baruch Shem, causing it to have a hafta love for God. When that happens, something new is triggered. The divine soul on its own has, of course, love and reverence, but it's like a wick. It's limited. In Gan Eden, even before the soul comes down to the body, it's b'chol nafshecha, he called it. It's a love, but it's contained in a lefia keli. Now that it has to engage with the animal soul, so it has to exert itself. And not only exert itself, it doesn't really talk about the exerting itself. I should correct myself. I added that. But most importantly, it is now tapping into the potency and the tremendous power that lies in the shemen that is rooted in Tohu. So even though it fell lower, but it's rooted in Tohu and the intense energy of Tohu. So when you can tap into it and harness it and direct it, it creates an even more intense love for godliness. And that is b'chol ma'idecha, bli gvul. So even though it's still a wick, and even though the nefesh habamis is also defined and a finite entity, but like a flame can light another flame ad infinitum forever. Unlike the love with water, water ultimately gets depleted. So even though it's not bli gvul amiti from our end, but because it's bli gvul, we've gone out of our comfort zone, out of our containers. So we're able to then access and draw all the way to bli gvul amiti, Ohr Ein Sof, b'cheli yatir, and that's the yofa sha'achas b'tshuva ma'asim tevim, the tshuva that we do that specifically below, that increases the light even more than the nefesh alikis would have on its own. Okay. So, to the point that it also becomes ready, as he said, the last point he made was that afterwards, now that the nefesh abamis is primed and has been harnessed, afterwards will come down even a higher level of Torah Ohr, Ein Sof Mamish from above. Doesn't elaborate on that, but he mentions that. Now, all this is in the first candle. We haven't yet talked about the candle of a mitzvah. So in other words, a neshama on its own has the capacity to do this. And simply put, you can daven, say Shema, Baruch Shem, contemplate on God, and have an effect on your animal soul, even if you don't particularly do a special mitzvah, even though the fact is davening itself is a mitzvah, which he doesn't address, but I'm just pointing that out. But hypothetically, a person, let's say, is not even davening, but they're contemplating on God, you could you could actually affect your animal soul. So now comes, however, another dimension. Now we're introduced to Ner Mitzvah. That Hashem blessed us and said, I'm not just giving you a soul that's a candle, it's a wick that can power, that can create light. I'm giving you an additional resource. It's called my mitzvah. I'm giving you mitzvahs. My own mitzvahs. Hashem's mitzvahs. And the mitzvah will catapult you even more than the neshama can do on its own. And that's why I gave the example of the slingshot. Because as much as you can throw a stone on your own, it doesn't come to what you can do with instruments, with tools and weapons, you can even say. Like we see, that a person can only go that far, but if they have particular, what he calls levushin. Levushin doesn't just mean garments as in clothing. Levushin means in general, tools, instruments, it can be even weapons. We say sometimes levushim is tikkunim, ornaments. Bottom line is, here's an additional tool called a divine tool, a divine instrument, mitzvahs that help the person go beyond what the neshama could on its own, down below. And let's just spell it out in simple English. Let's take the mitzvah of tzedakah. Okay? A soul in heaven loves God in Gan Eden and reveres God, Ava v'yir. But don't have the mitzvah of tzedakah of meeting a poor person or someone in need and helping them. First of all, there's no aniyim in heaven. So the mitzvah of tzedakah is not there. Down below, we have a world where the world has wealthy people, has poor people, a world that needs chesed. Your chesed. Now your chesed is in your soul. Your soul has the power of love, has the power of kindness. But then, go to shul, you see a pauper, Yav Pruta La'ani Bahadar Masi talked about tzedakah during davening, before davening, or whatever, the mitzvah of tzedakah. What happens now? So as much as the soul can yearn for God and teach the animal soul to also love God, the mitzvah gives you a whole new dimension. It draws out the chesed from the neshama that was there before, but it draws it out to a practical, actual mitzvah. And when you're mekayim this mitzvah, it catapults the neshama. Simply put, as I said, first of all, it draws out from the neshama the chesed that without that mitzvah, the neshama would have ava, but it wouldn't have it on that level. And as a result of that, like he said, I'm going back to page 38 to see. He said, when he called that all mitzvahs are called tzedakah, tzedakah tereimim goyish, tzedakah b'chesed, tzedakah l'mato, l'hachis ruach shvolim, v'ani chashuv kames, hevi yesem McCain, you draw down a tremendous amount of oil, what he calls nimshach ruach chaim l'mayla mechaya chaim, l'hachis mesim mamish, v'b'chinis yimin mekareves, v'yamine techapkeni mamish, b'era makiv shel l'mayla, shel l'mayla l'reimim l'halis es hanefesh l'mayla mayla b'era sof baruch hu mamish. V'zel in the Ner Mitzvah. So what does the mitzvah do? The mitzvah added a whole new dimension, just like as I said, a person can have a certain amount of strength on their own. But when they have an extra tool, let's say a plow to plow a field, or a slingshot to shoot a stone, or any weapon, or anything that helps them, that helps the person get to a place they can never get to on their own. That's what the mitzvahs provide. So the mitzvahs add a whole new dimension of accessing Ein Sof that the neshama on its own below would not have. So that's why it says Ein Neshama b'lei mitzvah. Because Ein Neshama b'lei mitzvah, because even though the neshama has a certain amount of Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, but the mitzvah takes it to another level, because a mitzvah reaches makif. Makif is the Rotzna Elyon. The levushim of the mitzvah means it's outside of who you are, and that's why it can lift you up. Like he said several times, he said, in order to lift someone up, you need something from outside. The makif l'mayla. To use the word l'chein mitzvah saying levushim. He says like this. So in order to elevate somebody, now yes, you can pick them up, but you need something that surrounds them to lift them up to another level. And that leaves it up, like you said, like a slingshot. That he cannot elevate on his own. And then he says it again when he speaks about, that's why we put on talis and film before davening, because that's the makif of the mitzvah that helps the davening. Even though davening, we said, the neshama can elicit v'aftas Hashem lekecha. But it's a whole different level when it comes with the makif of talis and film, which what does what? And that helps then in the soul to transform the animal soul even more so, because the mitzvah is also a wick. So now we have a second wick, the wick of the neshama, the nefesh alikis. That is inserted within the oil of the guf and nefesh habanis. Now we have a wick that is now an extra tool, this extra instrument that is also inserted, because all mitzvahs, as he said, are mislapshim b'dvarim gashmi. Dvarim shenasma mitzvahs and gam kim elam atei. So they also are manifest in gashmis. But now it's more than just the soul manifesting in gashmis, the soul together with the mitzvah. Now you have a whole nother dimension of elevation. So it reaches up all the way there, and that is what the mitzvah adds. Nimsa mitzvah b'chinas psila shebo v'ayod nichla Hashem ba'ed, because the mitzvah helps a person take klaf of film, puts on film. There's the parchment, that's the gashmius of klipas nega or moyes tzedakah, and the money that he gives to charity, the examples he gives. And all of that helps elevate to Malchus, and these mitzvahs are rooted in Malchus of Atzilus, and the beginning is wedged in the end, so that Malchus of Atzilus goes all the way to Malchus of Ein Sof. Like we learned earlier, that is the level that ultimately leads it to Torah Ohr. Yeah. The Torah Ohr. The Torah Ohr, which is a complete Blik Voldika level of Ohr. So that's somewhat of an additional explanation, in addition to what we already discussed and learned, of these two levels of Ner, the Neshama, and now together with the mitzvah. And like he said, so Ein Neshama b'lei mitzvah, but he also said Ein mitzvah b'lei Neshama. Yeah. Mitzvah b'lei Neshama Ein a klum, he's called it. Mitzvah b'lei Neshama Ein a klum. And what I said yesterday, I stand by as far as the proof. The kola ein li ala teda is gam teda ein like that. But pashtus, it means that if you only have teda or like mitzvah without the neshama, which could be both a person's soul, but also neshama as in kavona, as in primius, it's not ein a klum. What is it? So you can't just have teda. Just a Torah without the neshama that relates to it, that affects and permeates. Okay. What he doesn't explain here, but we need to rely on what he said earlier, is the difference between Ner Mitzvah and Torah Ohr. But he did explain that in the previous minor. So, and also earlier this mimer, and that is because Torah Ohr goes even higher because it's a mitzvah is still a Ner Mitzvah. It's a Ner, but it's light, but it's a Ner. And Torah Ohr brings it to a whole other level of Ein Sof Mamish, Hamshachim L'mayla L'mata, whereas a mitzvah is L'mata L'mayla. So even though a mitzvah does come from above, like you said, it's a makif from above, but at the end of the day, it's doing it through it's a mitzvah that manifests like a wick in the physical world. And the mitzvah is defined. Torah is Aruchim Eretz Midas, Bli Gvul. Like he said, that's why Torah every day you have to learn something new. In Tefillah, he said it's all the same nusach every day because we're dealing with one finite entity, and that is ultimately refining the animal soul. So it's one halah, as he called it, or what we learned here was the expression that it's the expression he used was because the same idea. Yeah. So that's the difference between the two. But he said that Torah Ohr brings up the Ein Sof, the Ein Sof that comes the way it is above. That's how it comes down below. So it brings it to Chakim B'lei B'Chachmi Yediyah. That's what ultimately Torah Ohr adds to the picture. But the mitzvah is what leads it to that point. So the mitzvah refines the animal soul. Torah is not so involved with the animal soul and with Gashmias. Torah is what comes afterwards, that you have Elikus, as it is above, that's how it is below. Yeah. And remember, he also said that Torah is nechas in the psila. So Torah Ohr, the light on its own, is channeled into the wick, which is the mitzvah, because Iker, the Yisidus of Torah is the mitzvahs. Just tying up a few more knots here. Okay. One more thing I'll add. I already mentioned this in the Yala, in the Tzemach Tzedek's gloss on this Maimer, on these Maimorim, printed in Tehillim, on the pasuk in Kapitel Kuf Yud Gimel, the pasuk Hamagbihi Hashem Elokeinu Hamagbihi l'Sheves. He says there are two ways to understand the Torah Ohr. One is Ner Mitzvah Torah Ohr. You could say the Ner itself, the mitzvah itself has all three elements. The wick, obviously, the wick is inserted in Gashmi, it's the oil that it transforms, and the Ner, the light that it creates. And that's not necessarily Torah. That's Ner Mitzvah. Or you could say Ner Mitzvah Torah is one extension. Ner Mitzvah is the wick and the oil. And oil is the Torah Ohr. So it's really like two levels of light. The light of the Mitzvah, which is a smaller light, a more limited one. And the Ein Sof, the infinite light of Torah. Or we talk that the Mitzvah is focused mostly on the wick, and it's manifesting within the oil, and the Ohr is the Torah Ohr. He says both ways. He says Ohr. You could interpret it both ways, which may be relevant later when we connect this to Ayin Beis. But I do want to do one thing before we continue learning. I want to take you back to Ayin Beis now. Let's go back to Ayin Beis, page 1351. 1351, after the Rebbe Rashab explained Ner Neshama Nishma Sadam, so at the bottom of page 1351, he said, and I'm going to read inside because it's short, but it's how he sums up Ner Mitzvah. So even though later in Ayin Beis, at the end, he doesn't go back to Ner Mitzvah, but he did talk about it at the beginning of the subject. So he says, "Kamoi came b'Ner Mitzvah yeshkam ken gimel dvarim hanal." V'apsili hi mitzvah. The gimel dvarim is the wick, the oil, the fuel, and the flame. Says that the psil is the mitzvah, vu harotzen ha'elyon ha'mislabish b'dvarim ha'gashmim, k'may b'tfilin v'tzitzis. So the rotzen ha'elyon, that's a makif, that's mislabish in physical matters. That's a wick. That makes it a wick. Like in film, the parchment, tzitzis, the wall. Who could the isa b'medrash tanchuma pasha ekev? Should be fine. Kabdos ha'mitzvah shein shluchai. Honor the mitzvahs that they are my messengers. So the mitzvahs are God's messengers. Who is galus rotzen ha'elyon? Meaning it's an extension of what God wants. So it's like a messenger of God's. Shazem mitzvah v'zem mitzvah. This God loves shazem mitzvah v'zem mitzvah. This is a mitzvah. Here's another mitzvah. Vayidei ha-mitzvahs, and through the mitzvahs, mis'alim hadvarim hagashmi. Through these mitzvahs, the physical matter, physical items of this world are elevated. That the vitality of the Ma'aseh mitzvahs of performing the performance of mitzvahs, v'kiyuman, and their sustenance, is completely nullified compared to l'gabi rotzen ha'elyon. In other words, the mitzvah is all about manifesting rotzen ha'elyon and malubish bay. But nasalei mamash keguf l'neshama. So when you're doing a mitzvah, what's happening, you're not just following God's orders. That mitzvah is God's will manifesting in the physical world. And therefore everything becomes but l'gabi rotzen ha'elyon, that's manifest within this mitzvah, and it becomes the mitzvah you're doing. Let's say the tefillin becomes mamash a guf l'neshama. The physical is now becoming a guf l'neshama, like a body to the soul. That's its real vitality of the mitzvahs. V'chein halavush hachitzon shel hanefesh shel hakis. And Tanya continues, it also becomes the levush hachitzon, the outer garment of the divine soul. Okay. Valkein, continuing in Ayin Beis, page 1352. Valkein gam evrei gufa adam nasim hakava mamash. So therefore, also the limbs of the body of the person become mamash like a chariot, a vehicle. In other words, it doesn't have independent consciousness, independent identity. It becomes a vehicle for God's rotzen. So when you're giving tzedakah with your hand is now an extension of the Ratzon Hashem. On your own, without the mitzvah, you do with your hand whatever you do. Now you've turned your whole being, first the gashmis of this world, like you said, Kayesh Lamaisa mitzvahs. I remember. Yeah, Nasmakava Mamas. V'hu inyan v'yaminai techapkeni. This is the idea that with Yaminai, with his right hand techapkeni, you embrace me. You've embraced me. Because it's one thing is you have two separate entities, and one person does something for the one they love. But if it becomes a makava, you're literally becoming like a vehicle, so it's a full embrace, like we learned before in Torah. That's exactly what he said about tzedakah. You mean it to chapkeni. It's completely encircling. You mean mekarebes. For who? And this, the Rebbe Rashab continues, Shahagili Momaila Shabamaisa mitzvahs. That the gili from above, the Maisa mitzvahs, Harizeh Mekarev, Kol Hadvarim Hagashmim, they bring closer to God all physical matters, Sheitachas Memshalas Klippas Nega, that are under the control of and the rule of Klippas Nega on their own, Klippas Nega, the shell that covers up the godliness. So all those things in the physical become encompassed through mitzvahs in godliness. So that's one thing he says. And then, which actually in Torah Ohr, it doesn't really spell out all these details about godliness, but then he goes on and says, "V'gam yesh ba mitzvahs gula." Then there's another thing that the mitzvahs have is gula, a feature. Skula pratis, a specific feature. Lahalis is hanefesh habamis. Till now, he's been speaking about its connection to gashmis. that is bringing the Ratzon Elyon, that the physical world on its own has its own independent agenda and consciousness. A mitzvahs align and turn the physical world into a vehicle for the divine. And now it also has an effect that it elevates the animal soul, the kashra be'ed Ein Sof Baruch Hu, to bind it in Eid Ein Sof. So you see from the Ayin Beis that he's actually elaborating and adding some points that you don't find directly in Torah Ohr. I think some of it is from the Mittler Rebbe. We'll see that when we learn that minor. I just wanted a comparative study here because we're learning the Torah Ohr. This is the Ayin Beis that corresponds to this Torah Ohr. Okay. Then he goes on. This is a key here. Then he says, what about Torah Ohr? V'ateilah hi ha'oyer. Ner Mitzvah, we just explained, Ner is the wick. Torah, he says, is the oyer. So based on this, it sounds like it's mashma the second way the Tzemach Tzedek interprets that the oyer is Torah. Even though he did say that mitzvahs elevate, but he didn't focus on the light that comes out of it. He just said they're all encompassed in Elikus. But Torah, he says, here oyer. And what does Torah Ohr mean? Why is it called Ohr, not Ner, not a wick, not a small wick, a narrow wick? Because this introduces a new dimension, an Ohr Atzmi, not an Ohr that's the Erech V'Kelin, an Ohr that's commensurate to the finite entity of the wick, but it's an Ohr from Atzmus Eid Ein Sof Baruch Hu. So in Torah Ohr, he didn't use the word Ohr Atzmi. If you look, he did use Eid Ein Sof. He said that clearly, and that's higher than Ner Mitzvah. And here he brings what the Torah Ohr says: it reveals the depths within the darkness. That is very deep, deep, deep. Who can find it? That we're talking about the primis and atzmus that's even higher than revelation. It's the etzem Ohr. U'komoshin is bar le'il, like we learned earlier in Ayin Beis. The hachachmi atzmi, chacham is an atzmi, not like the other spheres. It's a core entity. U'bo nimshach mibchinas atzmus dein sof, and in it is manifest and transmits atzmus dein sof. But Eid HaTeira, then he continues, this Eid HaTeira, the light of Teira, this Eid Ein Sof Atzmi, Nechaz Ba'Psila. It's holding on to, it's contained by the Psila, by the wick. Sheheina Mitzvahs. Ki Kol HaTeira Shalafanenu, Hein Teira Shabiksa, V'Teira Shmalpeh, literally the language from Teira Ohr, because the entire Teira, both the written Teira and the oral Teira, Ikra V'Yesod Ruba Mitzvahs. It's primary, and its foundations is the mitzvahs. The mitzvahs are what attach and connect this Eid Atzmi, this Eid Ein Sof of Teira, ima Adam va'elam, with the person and with the world. The two things he said before about a mitzvah that affects the gashmis of the world and it affects the nefesh habamis in the person. What does that mean? That the animal soul, and all the physical matter in this world, nichlolim, are encompassed by Eid HaTeira, in the Eid of Teira. So the ultimate goal is to bring it all the way to the highest levels of Eid. This means that the natural human intelligence, mamish, mamish, gets mamish transformed, mehapach el hafach, from one end of the spectrum to the exact other end. The Seichel Anushi Hamusig, and the Seichel Anushi and human intelligence that's a comprehensible human intelligence is transformed. The Seichel Chachmas HaTeira, Chachma Lekis, B'chinas Chakim B'lei B'chachmi Yedir. Transformed to a different type of level of wisdom, a wisdom, godly wisdom, that's really beyond wisdom, as we learned. It's not just understanding, it's a reality that's beyond just logic and rationale. So you see here how the Torah Ohr is literally the basis of the Ayin Beis. And then the Rebbe Rashab says, to understand this, nearly Levayan with the Inyan of Ohr Hariyah, which would go for a whole bunch of pages. And I'm saying bunch of pages, I mean literally over 100 pages, until he comes back on page, so that's page 1352. And then he comes back to it on 1463. So we're talking about 111 pages. Later, he comes back and says, now let's go back to Ner Mitzvah and Torah Ohr. And that's where he explains the Shemen, and it goes back to the idea, and then goes into the topic. So what exactly is the Avodah? How do we actually transform the animal soul? That's when he goes into the whole Yichud of Shema and Baruch Shem, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And with that, he concludes Ayin Beis, which is that Yichud helps us transform the animal soul, but that's where the Rebbe Rashab stops. So we're going back to the Torah Ohr that the Rebbe Rashab began with to understand the whole picture. So I just wanted to weave it together to show you how it's all interconnected. I hope
you cannot get the Torah Ohr without the mitzvah.
I hope I hope everybody followed that, and especially the whole context. After we learned most of the Torah Ohr, we didn't finish Torah Ohr. There's still one more section, but I just wanted to connect it because it's so blatantly connected. Okay, go ahead. What are you asking?
The Torah Ohr is the one that is transforming the sheker to the real thing, but you cannot get the Torah Ohr without the mitzvah, because the mitzvah is coming, right?
I don't know why you suddenly brought sheker into this. I know Torah Ohr uses that language, but I wouldn't use those words right now. That would not be, because remember, you have the neshama doing its work, then you have the mitzvah that transforms it. The Torah Ohr, what it introduces is the Hamshachim Almay to get a picture, to get an experience of godliness on God's terms.
Okay.
A mitzvah is Ratzon Elyon, that it manifests in Gashmi, so it's Ner Mitzvah, it's the wick. But we want to have Torah Ohr, Ein Sof Atzmi. The Ein Sof Atzmi, that's what he said here is what Torah. So the process is what he said, yeah. Ner Mitzvah with Torah Ohr. Can a person reach the Torah Ohr without the Ner Mitzvah? That's another discussion. Right now, the full picture is Neshama, Mitzvah, Ner Hashem Nishmasadam, Ner Mitzvah, and Torah Ohr.
Yeah, but I think you said it now, that without the mitzvah, you cannot get the Torah Ohr. Because
I don't know if that's correct, because there are people who can learn Torah and they're not doing a mitzvah. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, but that is not.
But he's not going into that. He's not getting into whether you could or you can't. He's just saying this is the best, the full picture. You could also, there's a lot of scenarios here. He's not talking about whether you could or you can't. He's saying that if you want the full experience, Neshama, Ner Mitzvah, and Torah Ohr.
Because I'm asking, without
I don't know. It doesn't address that question. I can't. That's something you can speculate. Can a person experience Torah Ohr without Ner Mitzvah? It's a good question. Doesn't address it. My answer would probably be you could to some extent, but it's much easier and much more complete if you do it in this order. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't go. Let's see with the Mittler Rebbe. I can't answer that explicitly because he doesn't go into saying what you could and what you can't. He's just saying what it is. He did say that you can't have a flame, you can't have a light without a wick. Because if you don't have the wick, the flame will immediately consume the oil and it won't burn. Or it'll be completely swallowed up by the oil. He said, Nitva b'shemen. So it's very clear that you have to have a wick in order to create the proper Torah Ohr. So in the mashal, for sure. So therefore in the nimshal, you have to also say that. That is the mitzvah that nechaz. Look, he said clearly that it's nechaz b'psila Torah because ikram v'yisedosam of Torah is the mitzvahs. So is there such a thing as Torah without mitzvahs? The answer is no. Torah means Torah came to give us mitzvahs, but the Torah adds Torah Ohr to it. So technically correct. The mitzvah is the wick that ultimately, in which the Torah manifests. So if someone says, I only learn Torah, look like you said, Kol Emer Ein Li Ela Torah, Gam Torah Ein Li. You want to put it that way, for sure.
Didn't you say that, use the example, Rabbi, about the Rashbi had to leave the cave? Am I off base?
Relevant here.
I'm sorry?
How's that relevant here?
Well, he was only learning Torah in the cave, right? So, but then he had to go out and do something, right? I mean, to elevate that level of learning, I guess. I don't know.
No, he was in the cave because there was a decree that the Romans wanted to kill him. So he escaped to the cave to protect, to hide. And when he was there, he was learning Torah all the time, correct? There's a whole other story. Then when he came out, he was so intensely spiritual that whatever he looked at began to burn. But it's not relevant to our discussion here.
Okay, thank you.
Everybody, I mean, even Torah and Ner, even someone that's completely learning Torah also needs to say Shema. And certain mitzvahs they have to do. I mean, that's what you're asking. Are there people that have Torah without mitzvahs? Everybody has to have mitzvahs. Certain mitzvahs, everybody's mechuyev. Even someone Torah and Ner. Not tefillah, prayer not, but Shema, yes.
Yes.
That's
okay.
what the cave is a whole other discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so one second here. Okay. Are there any other questions?
In Lamed Ches Dalet, he is saying, המצווה היא הפסילו שמתלבשת בנפש
We just read it in Ayin Beis, exactly that same language, correct? Yeah.
הלויסו ולקשרו באויר התוירו, שהיא בחינס חכים ולא בחוכמה ידיעו הפך
We just learned that. We just learned it at length. I just read that, yeah.
So the mitzvah is the psilo that is going in nefesh achiyunis lehaloiso or lekashro beoyer hatoiro. Without the psilo, you cannot get the oyer, because the oyer hatoiro does not mean limod hatoiro. It means.
What's your point? What are you saying? You want to make a case that you can't get to Torah without mitzvahs? Is that what you're trying to get to?
Yeah, that's what he's saying. He called me.
I don't see that in Torah that he says you can't get to it without the mitzvah, but I'm fine with saying that. I don't know if that's the point in Torah. It's part of the picture, yeah. I'm not sure. What are you concerned about? That you can get to Torah without a mitzvah? No one said that.
I think that the whole entire Maimer, I think so, is coming to tell us that you need the Ner Mitzvah in order to bring down the nefesh, to bring up the nefesh achiyunis, to be able.
I think you're just you're confusing me and maybe others as well. I'm not sure what you're adding. That was not said. That's what I'm not clear about. What are you adding?
Okay,
We just learned. That's what we learned. The whole Maimer is Ner Hashem Neshama Stardom. No, if you want to sum up the Maimer, that's not the way. You sum it up like this. There's a Ner called Ner Hashem Neshama Stardom. There's a soul that's a wick that manifests inside the body of an animal soul, and through Shema and Baruch Shem, it transforms and harnesses the animal soul to love God. Then there's a mitzvah. The mitzvah is a levush, a makif, that brings it to a whole other level, like a slingshot instruments, like I elaborated before, that bring out even a higher level of prayer that the Neshama on its own could not have achieved. And the mitzvah leads to Torah Ohr, which is Ein Sof, as it is Lamailo. That's how it comes down Lamata. The mitzvah is Lamata Lamailo, and Torah is Lamai Lamata. That's the summary, what he says here. That's what he wants to say. So, what would you like to add to that?
No, I think that it's not only that it is Milmailo Lamato. Torah Ohr is a different Gilui that is transforming everything, but you cannot reach it. Only to the mitzvah asher or noichi.
Okay, so you said what you had to say. Let's move on. Okay, that's what you're taking. Fine, I'm not going to argue with you. I don't know I'm not sure. That's not what he's coming to say in this Maimer, that you can't reach Torah without a mitzvah. That's not the theme of the Maimer. It's part of the picture, Ner Mitzvah, and then to Torah Ohr. Yeah, Torah Ohr is the ultimate Hamshacha Mamayla Lamata. Ein Sof Lamayla Kamay Lamata. You just read that section. Why don't you read on top of Lamed Ches Dalet on top of the page, and at the bottom of the previous page? Achat Torah Ohr, he starts. That's how he starts with Torah Ohr. And then he goes and speaks what that means. The Torah Ohr brings higher than Ishtalshus. And then he goes on to explain how the process. First comes the Neshama, then the Ner Mitzvah, and then Torah Ohr.
Okay. Shakoyach.
And the whole thing is with Rabbi Yehuda, who's quoted in Zikr that he was Terosim Nasa, he brought that Amshach of Torah Ohr. It's a bittul betachlis. That's ultimately Torah brings ultimate bittul, and the highest level because it's Ein Sof Mamish, like he calls it Eir Atzmi. And this Eir Torah Mechaz and Eschaber mitzvahs, the mitzvah, like we said, good. So it's the mitzvah is the wick, like you said earlier. I said clearly that without the wick, the flame wouldn't burn. It would either completely get extinguished in the oil, or it would burn up the oil so quickly that it would never burn properly. So the wick is the mechaber, clearly between that. In other words, Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum without the kav cannot work. The kav in this case, the psila, is like the mitzvah. Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum is Torah. You want to put it in those words. And the kav comes down into Eris and Kalim, into the Shemen, into the physical world. Ultimately, it elevates it to the kav and all the way back to Ein Sof, which is Torah. That's where the full transformation goes. That Seichel Eliki, Seichel Adam becomes Seichel Eliki, and it's all nepach to Ein Sof. So if you want Ein Sof, if that Tzimtzum is Torah, the kav is the mitzvah, and then the kav enters into the kalim of the world and to the guf and nefesh habamis as well. That may help also round it out. Is that clear?
Yeah.
So it's correct. You cannot one second. Holding down Gashmi. Yeah, he also says there that Torah consists of addresses all Gashmi's things. Seder Kochim is called Balechayim, and Seder Zerayim is called Atzameach. Yeah. The importance of mitzvahs is because mitzvahs is also the mamutza to Gashmis and Elokus. Torah is not really connected to Gashmis. The Neshama is also a connection between Gashmis and Elokus. Ner Hashem Yishmasod, that's why it's a Ner. And it's interesting, in the pasuk Ner Hashem Yishmasod, you don't have the word Ohr. Whereas in Ner Mitzvah, you also have Torah Ohr. So those are the triangle we talked about, the triad that achieves the ultimate purpose. Are there any other questions?
I think one thing that you just mentioned off of the Ayin base that's actually like amazing now that we read it is that the second level, the mitzvah, is when you do you're actually reaching Atzmut, which is actually the Hel and the Atmi, not the Or. I mean, it is Or, but point being that it reaches even a higher, the actual Atzmut itself. I think that's a profound. What's
that? Where did you see that he brought Halama Atzmi? I think deliberately he does not bring that level. Where do you see Halama Atzmi?
No, you said, I'm sorry, Atzmut. You just said it yourself. You just read Rabbi Reshav's on 13.
Or Atzmi, not Halama Atzmi.
Or Atzmi. Okay, got it. Okay, thank you.
And that's through Torah. Torah is Atzmi. Look, if you think about it, it's very practical in a certain way. When you learn Torah, you're learning God's wisdom. Even though it talks about mitzvahs and tells you how to do a mitzvah, but the bottom line is when you're learning Torah, you're not engaging with putting on tefillin that's made out of a parchment. Good, there's a seichel of your mind is learning Torah. But generally speaking, Torah is a revelation, it's intelligence, it's God's wisdom. When you're doing a mitzvah, you're engaging with the physical world, whether it's tefillin, talis, tzitzis, tzedakah. So each one has their role. Torah ultimately is giving us a picture, a snapshot of God's mind, CAT scan of God's vision, if you wish, God's vision. Mitzvahs is the implementation of it in this physical world. And the world itself is the shemen that we transform. That's how it works with Torah, Ner Mitzvah, Torah Ohr. So it makes sense. Torah is Ohr, it's pure Ohr. Mitzvah is the wick that channels that Ohr or allows that Ohr to manifest as you transform this physical world. So in other words, if a person just had Torah and the physical world, there can be some interaction, but it's not going to be total transformation, and it will not really integrate properly. The Neshama is the activator of all of this. The Neshama is the one that both does a mitzvah and learns Torah. So the Neshama is critical in this whole process. The way he said earlier is that tzarich lahagdim, his bonus will never sell the kiss. So it's not just, if a person just gets asked the question, what happens if a Neshama doesn't do its part? All it's doing is doing a mitzvah and learns Torah. That's not enough. The Neshama has to contemplate. The Neshama has faculties, has a mind, has emotions, and they have to contemplate and feel godliness. That's the first step. Once you have that, then the mitzvah and the Torah can lift the Neshama to a whole other place it can never go to on its own as it is below. Then there's another thing that happens afterwards, that the Neshama is higher than Torah and higher than everything. That, as I said, we'll discuss later. That's not right now. That's at the end of the process. Right now, we're talking about the process once we're down below. These are the three things. So Neshama is working with mitzvahs and Torah. It's working with its own fire, so to speak. It's Ner, its own candle, its own light, the divine energy within the Neshama. The mitzvahs bring out even much more of that energy, like any instrument, like any keli, like any tool that can help something go a lot farther than it can on its own, like a slingshot. And Torah is the ultimate experience where you bring mamshech mamayla lamata. So it makes sense that mitzvahs are mamata lamayla because they're bringing it, elevating Gashmi's world with a makif. The Ratzon Elyon in Gashmis, and then Torah is mamayla lamata, which is very vital in the whole discussion. Tefillah is obviously a real mamata lamayla, even more than mitzvahs. But I'll talk about that later. I think now it will just confuse matters. We'll talk about that because that's very relevant to the whole Ayin Beis picture. But that's the story as we speak about it. And again, I added the example of tzedakah, for example. When you do tzedakah, you see it brings out, it actualizes the soul's powers more than the soul would actualize on its own. So in this world, you have to deal with, let's say, a pauper, or you have to deal with the parchment, and you turn it into a mitzvah. That takes the neshama to a whole other level, propels the soul to another level that it would not have on its own, like he said. Okay. I'm ready to continue unless somebody wants to ask anything.
How would you explain that kol haTorah, Ohr haTorah hazeh, nechaz u'mischaber lemitzvah, because ikoron v'yesodoison hi b'mitzvahs?
It's obvious. Rashi says in the beginning of Chumash, why does the Torah begin with Bereshit bara not hachedesh hazeh lechem? Implying because the Torah came to give mitzvahs. It didn't come to tell us who created the world. So why does it start with hachedesh hazeh lechem? Torah is primarily a book that's coming to tell us what God wants of us. What God wants of us is the mitzvahs that we should do. Obviously, Torah has a lot more than that. It also has the narratives of Gan Eden, of B'nai Elam, Gan Eden, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Torah is Melosh Neirah, but it's where does it really manifest? So someone says, how do you manifest Torah in this world? Is by following its instructions. A melech can give you his book of laws, but the bottom line is you have to fulfill those laws. If you don't fulfill them, you're missing the point. So it's not just about reading and learning what God wants, it's actualizing what God wants. That's what a mitzvah is. That's my simple understanding. And a little deeper, I would say like the psila, the wick. that the wick is what manifests the Torah Ohr in a way that we can tangibly do something in this world. If we live in a material world and a world that has all kinds of structures and definitions. Each mitzvah corresponds to another part of this physical world. Torah itself is the book, is the sefer. The Malchus, it's Chochmah Malchus, it's Chochmasi Yisbarach. So it's the mitzvahs that are like the wick that allow the fire of God, the light of Torah, to manifest in existence. Like I said before, the fire alone and the oil, if you only had Torah and the physical world, you wouldn't have the ability to integrate godliness into existence. They'd be too far apart. One would compromise the other. Like I said, Eirei self-finite tzimtzum without the kav, without the tzimtzum and the kav, you can't make a dina b'takdein. Teira leiva shamayim hi. The whole Teira is to come into tachtenim in this world and transform it. That's the Ikar Yisrael. That's how I would explain it. I'm sure there's more to say on it, but that's a brief answer. Okay. Now this last part of Torah Ohr, talking about now page 40. 40A and B, and with that he concludes the minor. So we have another column and 3/4. It goes back to the pasuk Hamagbihi. Remember Hamagbihi l'sheves ve'amashpili lireis b'shamayim v'aretz. So we learned in the initial mimer that Hamagbihi l'sheves, the yud, is the yud of Havaya of the hay, and that's the mitzvah. And he said that is it says that elevates the yud. L'mayla, l'sheves, and it manifested in this world. He said that's mitzvahs. The second half of the verse, hamashpili lireis, he said that's Torah that comes from above, comes down. So Hamagbihi is elevate, and mashpili is to descend. Mamata of mitzvahs and the mamata lamata of Torah, and it's lireis riyah, whereas the Neshama is Shema Yisrael, Shmi. That's a summary of what we learned in the end of on bottom of 38d and 39a. So now he's going to elaborate a lot more on this in this beard, which is a beard on that minor. So we're going to learn it, but I'm just giving an introduction. The hay, the yud, the So let's begin. We'll learn a few lines, and then we'll. So on top of 40a, he says, "Zehu Hamagbihi." This is the meaning of the word Magbihi, l'sheves. The hayud achad hey huyatir. Why doesn't it say Hamagbiya? What's this yud Hamagbihi? The commentaries all ask this question. So he didn't ask it earlier. Well, he's also not asking, he's just saying the hay seems to be, the yud seems to be extra.
What's the point you just made?
Okay, so he said like this. The yud is coming to tell us, he wants to say, Shaliyah Zud, the Malchus d'Atzilus, Sanikre Hay, that this Aliyah of Malchus d'Atzilus, which is the hay, that it should go up, it should elevate to the point that it goes all the way up to Malchus of itself. How does that happen? That's the Yud, the final Yud. So the Yud is coming to emphasize, he's saying, that this Aliyah goes all the way up. That's what the Yud is emphasizing and is underscoring. Now he said that more or less earlier in the first mimer. He said Magbihi Yud Shebesh Dalet of Dalis. The less one go done. The Yud Al Yidei Yud Shebetecha becomes Hey, and then he said struck at him, yeah, the Hamagbihi is beginning to say, Yud Shebehei L'mayla Mayla Be'er Yosef Baruch Hu Mamash. So that's what he said. But he added now Malchus of Ein Sof because that's what he began talking about, the whole idea with Torah Ohr. In the beginning of the Maimer, he spoke about in Ner Neshama Malchus Ein Sof Shabbat, where the Tzimtzum happened, where the Kav begins. So he says now that's what the Yud comes to emphasize. So Malchus is Hey. The question is, how high does this Hey go? So he goes all the way to Malchus of Ein Sof, and that's the Yud. That's what the Yud is emphasizing. The Malchus the Atzilus, who b'chinas Dalet. Malchus the Atzilus on its own is a Dalet. Dalet from the word Dalus, as in poor, as impoverished. The less lo megamo klum, because Malchus on its own doesn't have anything on its own. Yeah. Ubam shachas ha-mitzvah. But when you come and you do a mitzvah, the amshach that a mitzvah does, nasa b'teichi yud. What you're doing is taking Malchus and you are adding and creating a yud within it. The nasa side is that b'chinas hey. You're taking this Dalet that on its own doesn't have anything on its own, and you're adding a yud. That's what the mitzvah does, and then it turns the Dalet into a hey. That's the one thing. But it's still, you could say, okay. Where does it go to? You just said that it did something to the Dalet, made it a hey. So now comes Validei HaYud Shebetecha, and through this Yud, Hi'elo L'mayla Be'er Ein Sof Malchus the Ein Sof. So the Yud in Hamagbihi. So it sounds to me that what he's saying is, but I'm not clear about it when he says Yud Betecha, is he talking about the same Yud in the Hey? Or is he talking about the Yud after the Hey in Hamagbihi? Which seems to make sense. But he does say Betecha. So Yud Shebetecha then would be not the Yud in the Hey, it's the Yud that comes after the Hey. That's what it seems like he's saying. But the Betecha is still not so clear. That's what's bothering me a bit. But bottom line is the Yud comes to add that not only did you make the Dalet into a Hey, but you elevated the Hey Malchus to Malchus of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. The Zeu Pirish Hamagbihi, and that's the meaning of Hamagbihi. Shalias Hahei, he Malchus Datzilus, the Malchus the Ein Sof. So it's not Hamagbihi, it's Hamagbihi, all the way to Malchus of Ein Sof, and that is why the Yud Shebetecha Hei. He says it again, Betecha Hei. So then why do you need a Yud at the end of the word? If the Hei Hamagbihi has maybe the Hey in Magbiya is not Malchus. That you have to say like that. That the Yud is the Dalet, comes the Hey. There's the Yud and the Hey. Yeah.
How about to say?
What's that? Shua nimshach hayidei kiyum mitzvah. That Yud is nimshach through the kiyum mitzvah. So the mitzvah makes the Dalet into a Hey by adding a Yud, and that Yud then propels that whole level of the Hey into all the way up to Malchus of Ein Sof. Okay, fine. Disregard the last Hey in Hamagbihi. The fact there's an additional Yud, that Yud is the Yud of the Hey, not that of that Hey, of Hey in general, which is the transformation from Dalet to Hey, and the Yud within the Hey elevates it all the way up to Malchus of Ein Sof. That's what he's basically saying. And in the mitzvah, and through the mitzvah, this aliyah takes place. That's what the mitzvah accomplishes. So a mitzvah goes into the physical world, which is rooted in Malchus of Atzilus. The mitzvah adds a lakus into it. It puts a yud into the Dalet that on its own is empty, less lemegamo klum, turns it into a Hey, and then elevates it all the way to Malchus of Ein Sof. That's a Hamagbihi. That's the Hamagbihi, means to elevate with the yud. Okay. Here I'm going to stop. Now begins a bracket, which interestingly goes quite a while. If I recall correctly, this bracket ends in the next column. The middle. Yeah.
What is the Dalet?
Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, what is the Dalet in that sequence of explaining the Yud, of putting the mitzvah in the Hey creates the Yud, creates a I guess it's an Aliyah or a Hamshacha. That's unclear to me. But what's the Dalet like in this
The
setup?
Dalet is Malchus on its own. So we know
Malchus.
Malchus of
Atzilus. Yeah.
The Malchus of Atzilus is the last of the 10 spheres, and there all the oil of the spheres gets diminished, like in the moon. It has no light of its own. And one of the reasons for that is because Malchus is going to be like the Tzimtzum, that's going to allow the creation of the next world. Malchus of that world becomes the Keser of the next world. So therefore, Malchus is the most diminished state on its own. And that creates Biyah, the next worlds. Okay, that's creation. That's the process of creation through the Helam of Dalet. So that's the Dalet, Dalus, the less Lomad Moklum, and it doesn't have anything of its own. But that's not where you want it to stay. You want now Neshama comes into this world and it does mitzvahs. The mitzvahs are meant to elevate now this dark world that was created by the darkness of the moon of Malchus, and you want to fill it up now with light. So this is the process, what we call the Tikkun HaLevana, or Tikkun Pagam of Levana, that the moon, the Malchus, that was so diminished, is now going to be filled up with light. And the mitzvah does that, because the mitzvah takes the physical world that was created by Malchus, and Mamshich, the Makif, what he said, the Ratzon, take, let's say, parchment of this world, the animal hide, you do a mitzvah with it. You do a mitzvah, you're now making the Dalet into a Hey. By what? Because the mitzvah brings a Yud into it. The Yud is the Elikus. You could say the Yud of Yud Kevovke, you could say it's the Yud of Nitzut Tzaliki, it's a spark. Regardless, it takes a Dalet that on its own didn't have the Yud and adds a Yud and makes it into a Hey. Okay. But you could say that's that. The question is, how deep does this interface go in the language of Ayin Beis? So he says it goes further. The mitzvah doesn't just keep it, the Malchus is now filled up, that the moon is like a full moon. Not enough. If you remember, we learned about many levels of how the moon, the face of the moon's elevation, Aliyas HaMalchus, Aliyas HaLevana. You want the moon to become as powerful as the sun and even more, all the way up to the highest levels. So he says the mitzvah, that's that. So until now we have Hamagbihi. Hamagbihi without the Yud at the end means that you brought a Yud into the Dalet and made it into Hey. Now comes another, the Yud is coming to emphasize that this Yud is taking it all the way up, not just to Malchus, to Zah of Atzilus, but all the way up to Malchus of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. And that's the Yud in Hamagbihi. The Yud that the mitzvah added into the Dalet, that turned it into Hey, doesn't stop there. It continues to elevate it all the way up to the highest levels.
And that's the chain reaction we discussed toward the end of Ayin Beis, I think.
It's the whole Ayin Beis talks about this.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure what you mean by the end.
The idea
talks about the interface.
Oh, I understand.
Ayin Beis never gets back to Ner Mitzvah and Torah Ohr. So
no.
Ayin Beis only talks about the Neshama, Ner Hashem, Nishma Sadam, how the Zbanus of Yichud Tata, Yichud Elah, and the joining of both of them.
No, I meant
talking about a mitzvah. The mitzvah is what does this aliyah.
I think we were talking Ayin Beis in the context of Ein Sham Shinui, and we were talking about whether our actions can affect Atzmus. And I believe, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but it's all in the context of the Neshama there. He didn't get back to Ner Mitzvah. Keep that in mind. Here we're talking Ner Mitzvah.
Okay.
Can the avodah of a person? We'll talk about that. The fact is, he's saying a neshama needs mitzvahs. Ein neshama b'lei mitzvah. So we're talking here what a mitzvah does. Can a neshama elevate the Malchus of Ein Sof without a mitzvah? Most likely not. That's why you need mitzvahs. If that's what you mean, yes, that the mitzvah, Hashem wants us to do a mitzvah, that's negeya ba'atzmus, in Maisa Tachtein. That's what you're referring to.
Yeah, that's what I was referring
Here
to.
it's more about negeya. Here he's talking about that. Yeah, yes, he did talk about elevating, correct.
Yeah.
That context you could connect it with. That when a person in Maisa Tachtein, meaning the mitzvahs below, that they reach all the way up to those highest levels. Yeah, in that sense, there is a connection. Yeah. Okay. So now, as I said, it's going to come a bracket. The bracket ends around, let's say, 3, 6, 9, 11 lines in the next column. So it's a long bracket that explains this idea, and then he goes back to the Shevis. Hamagbihi Shevis. But we'll stop here before the bracket. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll stop here. We're stopping here. Now there's a few lines in